Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on flaw questions in the logical reasoning section. About 14% of all logical reasoning questions are flaw questions, making it one of the most important question types to learn because it's the most common question type in the logical reasoning section. In this lesson, we'll cover the following: how to spot a flaw question, what the process is you want to take when approaching one, what are the reasoning structures common to flaw questions, and some examples thereof. And then we'll also look at the different trap answer patterns that you need to know about in order to make those eliminations. So let's get to it. In this question stem, it says, which one of the following describes a flaw in the reasoning of the argument above? The language that tells us that this is a flaw question is describes a flaw. This question says a questionable technique used in the argument above is, so the right answer should represent a questionable technique used or a flawed method of reasoning. This is definitely a flaw question. This one says the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it takes for granted. Well, the fact that it's vulnerable to criticism identifies this as a flaw question, but the fact that it says takes for granted that indicates that what we're looking for, the flaw that's contained in this argument, is that there's an assumption made, and we need to express that assumption in the right answer. This one says the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it fails to consider that. Now, the vulnerable to criticism tells us it's a flaw question, but it fails to consider that tells us that the idea that's in the correct answer should be something that would weaken the argument and should point to the connection across all of the questions in the assumption family. So the way we approach flaw questions is the same as everything else in the assumption family. So that's the sufficient assumption questions, necessary assumption questions, flaw questions, strengthen questions, and weaken questions. The process is the same for everything because they're measuring our ability to evaluate arguments. In order to get there, we need to be able to identify the conclusion and find the evidence for why it's true. That sets us up to be able to figure out whether or not the conclusion follows from the evidence. And in every one of the questions in the assumption family, the answer is no. The conclusion does not follow logically from the evidence. And it's our job to figure out what the gap in that reasoning is. So we need to evaluate the argument. Now, to evaluate the reasoning on any logical reasoning question, we want to use reasoning structures. So we want to start to look for comparison, causation, and conditional logic within the argument. That'll help us better figure out what the shape of the pieces are in the puzzle that has been presented to us. And that should help us better figure out what the missing puzzle piece looks like in the argument. Once we find that gap or that missing puzzle piece in the argument, then we can use that to anticipate what an answer would sound like, and then use our understanding of trap answer patterns to eliminate tempting but wrong choices. 71% of all flaw questions involve comparative reasoning. So let's take a look at an example here. Go ahead and give this question a try. Push pause, and when you're ready to discuss this one together, hit play again. All right, welcome back. So let's start by finding the conclusion of the argument. In the middle of the argument, we're given the word but, which is a pivot, away from an opposing point and towards the author's point. And then we're given the word therefore at the very end, which indicates the conclusion of the argument. So we know the conclusion is that we must not strike now. Now that conclusion is essentially advocating for one of two choices, whether we should strike or whether we should not strike. The argument or the union member gives us reasons not to strike. But before we get there, we're also given a reason to strike, which is that some members of the labor union are calling for an immediate strike. So we don't exactly know why they're calling for it, but we do know that it's supported by some members of the labor union. It doesn't indicate much of a benefit, but it does seem like it's pro-striking. Now, the reasons that the union member gives for not striking are that it would cut into the strike fund and that it would lead to a steep fine and that those would cause a major financial loss, right? So there's a negative impact financially. So the negatives, the drawbacks associated with striking. But in order to be able to compare these two choices, in order to be able to say which one we should go with, whether we should strike or whether we should not strike, we need a full picture of both outcomes. And while we're given some of the reasons not to strike, we haven't really ever considered what it would look like if we didn't strike and what would be the financial losses then. Right? Without knowing the financial losses or the financial benefits under both scenarios, can't really compare the two choices. So this is a classic incomplete pros and cons list. If we're asked to describe the flaw in the reasoning, we can just say that it has failed to consider information that would help us figure out the relative merit of the two choices, that it's failed to include information that would be relevant to the decision. If you look at answer choice A, it says it fails to consider that a strike might cause the union to suffer a financial loss even if no fine were imposed. Well, it does not provide a benefit of a strike. In fact, provides a drawback associated with striking. Instead, answer choice A says that it fails to consider something that would strengthen the argument. It should be it fails to consider something that would weaken the argument. So A is moving in the wrong direction, and it's wrong. Answer choice B says fails to define adequately what constitutes a major financial loss. So this one is that it's failing to define something. And if it fails to define adequately a term, right, what that means is that it's referring to a very particular flaw where a key term has been allowed to shift its meaning over the course of the argument. And in order for answer choice B to be the right answer, we would need to see a major financial loss used twice and for it to have different meanings throughout the course of the argument. In this case, it's only used once. It never shifts this meaning, and so it's simply describing the wrong flaw. Answer choice C says, fails to consider that the benefits to be gained from a strike might outweigh the costs. This says fails to consider that, that's important, and that the benefits to be gained might outweigh the costs. Right? This is saying that we haven't really considered the benefits that might come to us from striking, even though we have considered the costs from striking. And so this looks like a really strong contender. Let's hold on to answer choice C. Answer choice D says takes for granted that the most important factor in the labor union's bargaining position is the union's financial strength. Well, taking something for granted, right? That means that it's assuming something to be true. And it's usually referring to a necessary assumption. So is it necessary to the argument that the most important factor in the labor union's bargaining position is the union's financial strength? It doesn't need that. It doesn't need to assume that to be true. And so D is presenting something much stronger than what we need to assume in order for the argument to have a chance. Answer choice E says it fails to establish that there will be a better opportunity to strike at a later time. It fails to establish means that it assumes something to be true. Does this argument assume that there will be a better opportunity to strike at a later time? The argument doesn't really consider whether we should be striking in the future, only that we shouldn't be striking now. And so answer choice E brings up an irrelevant relationship, making answer choice C the right answer. All right, so let's look at another example. In this one, we're going to look at one that involves causation. Go ahead and give this one a try. When you have an answer that you like, hit play again, and we'll review it together. All right, we're going to start by finding the conclusion again. We have this word but in the middle of the argument, giving us a pivot away from an opposing point. And then we have the word so, giving us a conclusion at the end again. So the opposing point is that my friends say, I will one day have an accident because I drive my sports car recklessly. And then the evidence for the driver's conclusion is that I have done some research, and apparently minivans and larger sedans have very low accident rates compared to sports cars. That's a comparison being made between minivans and larger sedans have a lower risk of accident compared to sports cars. So we can put them on this risk curve. And then the conclusion is that trading my sports car in for a minivan would lower my risk of having an accident. And the key words there would lower. The driver is suggesting that merely trading in the sports car for a minivan, it will cause a lower risk. Right? So we have a cause and effect relationship in the conclusion. We've got a correlation between minivans and larger sedans and lower accident rates, but then a conclusion that suggests that a minivan would cause a lower accident rate. So we're moving from correlation to causation. And if we're asked to describe the flaw, we're going to say the argument mistakes a correlation for cause and effect relationship. Answer choice A says that it infers a cause from a mere correlation. That looks really good. Cause and correlation, right? Inferring a cause from a correlation. That looks exactly like we prefaced. Let's hold on to answer choice A. Answer choice B says that it relies on a sample that is too narrow. Well, the keywords there are a sample being too narrow. Like one potential flaw would be an unrepresentative sample, but there's not really a generalization happening within the argument. The argument doesn't say that because something is true in some cases, that it's true in other cases. And so B correctly describes a flaw, but just not a flaw that's happening in this argument. We can describe the incorrectness of B in that it's the wrong flaw. That's going to be a really common trap answer pattern on flaw questions. Look out for answer choices that correctly describe a flaw, but just not one that's actually happening in the argument. Answer choice C says misinterprets evidence that a result is likely as evidence that the result is certain. Well, the key here is that it's switching between likely and certain. The conclusion, trading my sports car in for a minivan would lower my risk. There's nothing certain about that. Lowering the risk does not mean that the driver faces no risk. So we're not talking about a certain outcome in the conclusion. It means we can get rid of answer choice C because while it is describing a flaw, it's not a flaw that's occurring within this argument. Answer choice D says mistakes a condition sufficient for bringing about a result for a condition necessary for doing so. The key terms here being sufficient and necessary, telling us that the flaw being described in answer choice D is mistaking a sufficient for necessary condition. That's reversing the logic of a conditional relationship, but this argument doesn't contain conditional relationships. So again, this is a flaw, but just not a flaw that's happening in the argument. Answer choice E says relies on a source that is probably not well informed. So the key words here are the source is not well informed, which implies that we're looking at an answer choice that describes an inappropriate appeal to an authority, right? Because so-and-so said something is true, therefore it's true. And maybe that person is not well informed and doesn't really know the subject. This is a flaw. You will see an inappropriate appeal to an authority on the LSAT, but it's not a flaw that's happening inside of this argument. So we can get rid of answer choice E for describing the wrong flaw, and that brings us back to answer choice A. Infers a cause from a mere correlation. That's the right answer. Now, one more example. We're going to look at one that involves conditional logic. 23% of all flaw questions involve conditional logic. Go ahead and give this question a try on your own. And when you have an answer choice that you like, hit play, and we'll look at it together. All right, welcome back. Okay, we're going to start with the conclusion again. And we see the word however in the middle of the argument, so we know that we have a pivot here. We're pivoting away from the opposing point and towards the author's point, and then we get the word hence at the end, so we have the conclusion at the very end. And the conclusion is that the anthropologist's claim is false. So what is the anthropologist's claim? The anthropologist is claiming that the human species could not have survived prehistoric times if the species had not evolved the ability to cope with diverse natural environments. The most important thing to notice in there is the word if. If is an organizational language cue that tells us that what the anthropologists are claiming is a conditional relationship. It's an if-then idea. So it's usually a good idea to go ahead and see what it is that they're suggesting. The anthropologists are suggesting that if we had not learned to cope with diverse environments, then we would not have survived. Now, the conclusion of the argument is that this claim is false. Remember, so we want to make sure that we understand the conclusion is the refutation of that conditional, not the conditional itself. And the evidence is that Australopithecus afarensis, a prehistoric species related to early humans, also thrived in a diverse array of environments, but became extinct. So it did cope in diverse environments, but it did not survive. And that is the evidence for why the anthropologist's relationship is false. To better see the relationship that's being refuted by the author, it might help to take that relationship and take the contrapositive and express it in more positive language. So the anthropologists are claiming that if we could survive, then we had to cope with diverse environments. In order to refute a conditional, you need to do two things. You need to meet the sufficient condition and deny the necessary. But notice, in this case, the evidence does not show that Australopithecus afarensis has survived but did not cope with diverse environments. Instead, it shows that Australopithecus afarensis, it coped with diverse environments and did not survive. So this evidence doesn't meet the requirements for refuting the anthropologist's claim. In order to do so, it should have showed that Australopithecus afarensis survived but did not cope with diverse environments. If we looked at the anthropologist's claim as saying in order for humans to cope with diverse environments, we would need to survive, then Australopithecus afarensis would be a relevant counterexample. This would weaken the reverse of the anthropologist's claim, but not what they actually said. So how do we describe the flaw in this argument? Well, the evidence would have refuted the reversal of the anthropologist's claim, but not the claim itself. And the reversal is the flaw. Right? The argument here is mistaking a sufficient condition for one that is necessary. If we reverse the anthropologist's claim, then the evidence works to refute it. But as it is stated, it's not enough to refute it. And so what we're really looking for is an answer choice that describes the flaw of mistaking a sufficient for necessary condition. Answer choice A says it confuses the conditions being required for a given result to occur in one case with the conditions being sufficient for such a result to occur in a similar case. This looks really good. This describes a sufficient condition and a necessary condition. Let's hold on to answer choice A. Answer choice B says that it takes for granted that if one species had a characteristic that had happened to enable it to survive certain conditions, at least one related extinct species must have had the same characteristic. So the key language here is that it's taking something for granted, and it's presenting this if-then relationship. But this gets things wrong on two fronts. First, in the if part, what is the characteristic that enables humans to survive? The relationship that's being challenged isn't whether or not something enables survival, but whether or not something is required of survival. So it gets the relationship wrong in terms of the connection between survival and coping with diverse environments. The word enables in the first part of answer choice B suggests that coping with diverse environments is a sufficient condition when the anthropologists are actually claiming that it's a necessary condition. And then in the second half of answer choice B, it's talking about a related extinct species must have had the same characteristic. What is that characteristic? Coping with diverse environments. This is suggesting that the conclusion of the argument is that Australopithecus afarensis was able to cope with diverse environments. But that's actually the evidence for why the relationship by the anthropologists is false. So answer choice B kind of gets one of the terms wrong and when it says enables instead of required. And then it reverses the argument by suggesting that the evidence of the argument is actually the conclusion of the argument. And so answer choice B is wrong. It's an irrelevant relationship. Answer choice C says that it generalizes from the fact that one species with a certain characteristic survives certain conditions, that all related species with the same characteristic must have survived exactly the same conditions. So the key word here is generalizes. Generalizes means that the argument is generalizing from a potentially unrepresentative example, that it's saying what's true of some is true of most or of all. But this argument is not doing that. It's not saying what's true of some is true of most or all. It's saying that this is a specific counterexample, thereby refuting the relationship. So the problem with this argument isn't that it's generalizing, but rather that it's an attempt to refute a reversal of the original claim. So answer choice C is describing the wrong flaw. Answer choice D fails to consider the possibility that Australopithecus afarensis had one or more characteristic that lessened its chances of surviving prehistoric times. The key words here being that it fails to consider. So D is suggesting that the argument failed to consider something. This thing, in order for it to be the right answer, should weaken the argument. But the fact that there was a characteristic that Australopithecus afarensis had that lessens its chances of survival doesn't actually weaken the argument. If anything, it makes it more clear why they weren't able to survive. So this is going to make the argument better, not worse, and that strengthens it. We're going to get rid of the answer choice D. Answer choice E says it fails to consider the possibility that even if a condition caused a result to occur in one case, it was not necessary to cause the result to occur in a similar case. Now, the key language here being that it fails to consider, right? So this should present something that would undermine the argument, but a condition caused a result. Nowhere does it say that a condition or coping with diverse environments caused anything to survive, right? So this gets the terms wrong. It's an irrelevant relationship, and we can eliminate answer choice E. And that means that answer choice A is the correct answer. As we were working through those examples, we were describing why answer choices were wrong. And answer choices are wrong on flaw questions for reasons relating to scope, logic, and degree. Now, answer choices that are out of scope will be the easiest ones to get rid of. Answer choices that correctly describe a flaw, but not one that happened inside of the argument, will be tempting, but wrong. Another one will be an answer choice that correctly describes something that happened, but that is not a flaw. And generally, this looks like it overlooks the possibility that, or it failed to consider the possibility that. So if it's correctly describing something that the argument failed to consider, it might be tempting. But if it's not a flaw, it doesn't matter. So pay attention to whether or not that issue that the argument failed to consider is actually presenting a flaw with argument. Answer choices that describe an irrelevant relationship. are wrong because of logic. Answer choices that strengthen, that do the opposite of what you're looking for them to do, are wrong because of logic. When an answer choice begins with takes for granted that, you want to be on the lookout for ideas that are stronger than what were actually assumed in the argument. So a common tempting but wrong answer choice is an answer choice that presents an assumption but presents something that is stronger than what was actually being assumed in the argument. And so the answer choice itself is simply too strong. It presents more than what the argument was assuming. But then answer choices that are too weak would become important when you're looking at one that describes what the argument failed to consider. So if the argument fails to consider something, then that idea should weaken the argument. And potentially, answer choices can get into trouble on weakened questions when they're not strong enough to actually impact the argument. And so you want to look out for, if you're describing a weakness in the argument, is it presenting that weakness in a forceful way that's enough to undermine the argument? Just like when it's presenting an assumption of the argument, is it presenting that idea in too strong a way, something that was stronger than what actually was assumed within the argument? So in summary, you spot a flaw question with the language in the question stem. You're looking for words like flaw in the reasoning, vulnerable to criticism, questionable technique, or fallacious reasoning. The primary reasoning structure on flaw questions that you're going to have to pay attention to is comparison, but causation and conditional logic also play significant roles. The trap answers you want to be on the lookout for are answer choices that correctly describe a flaw, but not one that actually occurred inside of the argument. Answers that are out of scope, those that are simply too strong when the answer choice should be presenting an assumption of the argument, those that are too weak when the answer choice is presenting something that should be attacking the argument, answer choices that correctly describe something that happened but that isn't a flaw associated with the argument, and then those that just bring up irrelevant relationships. So that's it for flaw questions. I invite you to check out these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.